there, welcome to the Soil and Roots podcast, cultivating deep discipleship in community. I'm Brian Fisher.
And I'm Kyle Moody.
And we have reached the end of season 3.
Wow, what a long, strange trip it's been.
Yeah, when I started it, I thought it was going to be like 8 episodes.
Really?
Yeah, and now it's been like almost a year's worth of episodes.
That's just awesome that God just orchestrated it to where he was like, nope, you got a lot more to say than that.
When we first started the season, within the first 5 or 6 episodes, I was getting these emails and phone calls like, hey, we love the 5 elements, but what do we do? Like, what's the how?
Mm-hmm.
And you might remember that I was like, I don't know.
We'll figure it out.
You guys figure it out. And then
right?
That wasn't, the audience didn't want that. They wanted it to drive to some sort of crystallized finish line, and that's what we've done. Yep. So we've created greenhouses as a concept of how we cultivate deep discipleship in community. And last week really was the first episode where we practically explained what it is and how they operate and why so many folks may have that desire, that longing to be a part of these specific communities we call greenhouse. So today we are greenhousing the greenhouse.
Yes.
Yeah, so think of episode 58 as the why and who, what, where, when. And now we're going to basically do a Q&A and talk about some of our own personal experiences in being in a greenhouse and why we really feel convicted, passionate to see more and more greenhouses form, really not only all over the West, but all over the world, because our own personal experience in a greenhouse, really, we are experiencing the 5 elements, at least in my life. I'm experiencing the 5 elements in ways I haven't experienced before.
Absolutely.
Having been in church my entire life, I can say with great certainty that the greenhouse, because it specifically and intentionally embodies time, habit, intimacy, community, instruction, it is, in fact, formative, and I think it has been for all the folks who have joined ours. So let's start with the why. Last episode, I kind of walked back through the 5 elements, and this whole season has been about the formation gap, the fact that most of us who have a desire to become more like Jesus, to live like he lived, and to think like he thinks, and to have his ideas, that process is an immersive, comprehensive, relational journey. But we live in a culture that tends to portray it as an intellectual journey, or perhaps as a purely emotional journey. And so we spent, the entire season exploring that in great detail, and then said, look, the solution is to reform the communities that Jesus started,
right, and
that Paul and Peter started, and recognizing that they're probably going to look a little bit different. We live in a completely different society, obviously, than the Roman Empire in the first century. So how do we adapt the 5 elements that Jesus modeled in a way that contemporary modern Christianity can get into?
So one of the big questions was, how is this any different than a community group? Like, that was the thing that when we first started out doing ours, that was one of the things that I was wrestling with, even though I knew it was going to be different, but I didn't know how it was going to be different. And so all of those things that you lined up, the recap for the first half of the episode, the last podcast episode, the first half was just a recap. And so as you're doing that outlines why this is different from a community group. Why now the community groups that I've been involved in the past, they started out with great intentions. They started out with, they had their philosophy of what they wanted to do, and they might have had a curriculum, maybe not, but it sort of turned into more of like a social club, or it became something that was, you felt obligated to do it. It was like, I'm in this now, so I've got to keep going with it, even though I don't really know what's happening. And it got kind of really disjointed. I think that is the thing that separates greenhouses from community groups, is the intentionality behind it. Because we have, like you said, you've set up these things that it's not going to drift. It's not going to kind of unravel, because we follow these rhythms that are in place, and that it's almost impossible for it to unravel because it has this structure to it. And that was the thing that was really different for me, being involved in this greenhouse and experiencing it.
So people sometimes ask me, well, is the greenhouse like a Bible study or like a community group? And I say, well, a greenhouse is a greenhouse. It's
Right.
not. It
It's
isn't either of
different.
those
It's
things,
unique.
at least in my experience. So it sounds a little bit weird because we're using a new term, and I mean, not that greenhouse is a new term, but we're not using it the way that normally would think of a greenhouse. But it is what it's different than the. That's the point. We are intentionally cultivating deep discipleship in a type of community that we've lost. Not that there are great things about Bible studies and community groups for sure.
Absolutely.
And they're to be honored and participated with. But the greenhouse is a unique animal. When you sit down and you say, look, we're going to meet twice a week, and every week we're going to work through these 4 rhythms: reflection, exploration, soul care, and spiritual habits. And we've time boxed those things, not because we're trying to rush anybody, but because we are honoring everybody's time and we're honoring the rhythms themselves. There is something really different that happens as a group, because everybody has the same expectation. Everybody knows exactly what we're going to be walking through. But I've found the conversation to be really rich.
Oh,
I mean, really, really rich.
and it's never to your point, it never feels rushed. It's not like, oh, okay, or well, we've got 5 more minutes and it's just dead space. It's never turned into that.
Right.
It's always been very fluid and very organic, if I can go along with the whole
Good job.
soil and roots thing. But it's
star.
just, yeah, thank you.
Yep.
I'll,
I know how much you like affirmation.
Oh man,
Gold
I
star.
tell you, now I'm going to be able to sleep tonight.
There you go.
So, but yeah, it's just the rhythm of it is very, very smooth. And we were talking about this before we started, but the role of the facilitator. And again, that's another thing that separates greenhouses, I think, is that you have these different roles. You have the facilitator, you have the host, you have the participants, that's outlined, that there's expectations for each of those roles and what that looks like. With the facilitator, you do a great job in our greenhouse of guiding that discussion and keeping the time constraints. I was reflecting on that before we started recording, was that's huge to be able to say, okay, well, we've got this amount of time set aside for soul care, so we're going to talk about that. We've got this amount of time, and it's not like you're not dictatorial about it, like, okay, but it's just you're mindful of it. And I think that's a huge role for the facilitator, to be mindful of it. Again, not to be an ogre, but to be aware that, okay, here's our time frame for that. Let's let that go. Again, if it bleeds over 5 minutes or so, whatever,
Right.
that's fine.
Right.
But to just be the rhythm, that's the other thing. Rhythms of greenhouses are different from anything that I've experienced. And that's what contributes, I think, to that rich discussion, because we know, okay, here's the time for this. And we go into that. And it's been, I look forward to it. And again, the other thing that I think a lot of people struggle with, or before they even get into it, is 2 times a week.
Right.
That's crazy. There's no way that can ever happen.
Yeah.
If that is your mentality, then for right now, I would think a greenhouse is not for you.
Right.
And that's okay. For the people that are like, 2 times, okay, I could maybe see that work. But you're still maybe a little trepidatious about it, that go for it and just see. Because again, my wife and I, we have 3 amazing kiddos. We've got all kinds of stuff going on. We're able to make it work. And it's not something like, oh my gosh, here we go. We got to get anything. It's something that we look forward to. And it's like anything else. Like you've mentioned before, you've got gymnastics, you've got t-ball, you've got soccer, whatever it is, you find ways to work around it. This, you find ways to work around it because you know how enriching it is. And like you said, every single time when we come out of one of our greenhouses, I am just so filled and so enriched by the conversations, and it's just, I can't speak enough about them, because it's just such an amazing way to see Jesus working and to see the Holy Spirit working, not only through me, but through the other people that are involved, and to feel their struggles and to celebrate with them. I mean, this is the kind of community that God set us up for.
Right. Yeah, I think the facilitator is a crucial role. We talked about it last episode, but this is not a role that we're used to envisioning in our current Christian ethos.
Right.
Somebody who's not there to teach.
Right. That's
who's
huge.
not there to correct. Who's not there to pick on every theological issue. Who isn't, quite honestly, picking up Bible verses and trying to instruct. That's actually not the point of the greenhouse.
No.
Because we assume in our current culture that instruction is available anywhere, anytime. We use the podcast episodes as the raw material, but even that is that's intended to generate discussion and exploration and disagreement. It's not intended to be disagreeable, but
Right.
it leaves open the possibility of doubt or disagreement, and those conversations go in all sorts of ways. I think the specialness, the uniqueness, if I can use that word, of a greenhouse is that everybody actually is coming with the intent of becoming more like Jesus. And everybody understands that they will be invited, not obligated, but invited to engage at a level of heart depth that, by and large, has been missing in much of our cultural, not our church experience, but our cultural experience. So, obviously, the critical question for me is the greenhouse, is it fulfilling its intention, which is to be a place where I am being formed more and more like Jesus? And I can say genuinely that is happening in my own walk. As I look at the fruits of the Spirit, as I research and study Jesus' life, the greenhouse is creating an ecosystem in which my heart is, in fact, embodying more of Jesus' ideas and less of my own. It's a lifelong journey. It's slow. It has ups and downs. There's no expectation that next week, we're going to be walking on water. However, the rhythms, those 4 rhythms, which are, pulled from antiquity primarily, do what they're set up to do, providing the facilitator gives space and breath for that to happen and doesn't look at it the way that we look at other great groups, which are more instruction or corrective. That's not what we're doing. This is a slow, intentional community designed to grow together to become more like Jesus, and it gives a lot of space for that to happen, and a lot of grace and a lot of kindness and a lot of gentleness and a lot of patience for that to happen. So, that's the key question for you. We've been in the greenhouse now together. Do you sense that you are becoming more like Jesus as a result of your commitment to that group?
Well, see, absolutely. I can say that without even thinking about it. But while you were talking about that, I started thinking about it, and it's amazing that you just asked that question, because the greenhouse facilitates the work that I'm doing in the spaces between the greenhouse.
Oh, that's interesting.
Oh, and that's another huge difference, is that the things that I am doing when I'm not in a greenhouse they are bringing forth, my relationship with Jesus is being formed. The things that I'm doing, the rhythms that I'm going through in my life outside of the greenhouse are then accentuated and explored and supported in the greenhouse as I go forward. And so it's not like, okay, well, I'm just waiting around and then I get to the greenhouse. Because I think that's another huge difference, is that this is not where you sit and get taught. This is where you're reflecting on your walk with Jesus and how you are being formed with him. That's another, I think, huge difference, because it's not, like you said, the facilitator is not there teaching. You don't teach. For heaven's sake, the creator of this it would be very easy for you to slip into that role, and you don't do that. You are just, what a great facilitator should do is guiding the discussion, and a great listener. You mentioned that. That's a huge quality of a facilitator, is to be a really good listener and allow these things to happen. And even when you do disagree, and we've had disagreements come up in our greenhouse,
Yes,
that's happened.
Yeah.
But it's handled in a way where it's like, okay, I'm not trying to convince someone that they're wrong. I'm not trying to convince someone that I'm right.
You're hinting at an important phrase, which is civil discourse, which is something that has been all but lost in our culture and to some degree in the church. So one of the things that a facilitator does is invites civil discourse. Now, again, we've been doing the greenhouse for a while. It's not like every week there's disagreement on issues. Most of the time there isn't. But when there is, the participants are invited to share their perspective
Mm-hmm.
and to share their disagreement with either the podcast or another participant in a way that may be passionate
Mm-hmm.
and may be direct.
Mm-hmm.
But the sort of underlying rule is we're all going to shake hands, hug, and part friends at the end, and we are disagreeing with positions. This is not a devaluation of a person.
Absolutely.
That, of course, is where our culture has fallen. Like, if I disagree with you, it means I'm devaluing you.
Mm-hmm.
In civil discourse, you give the environment where anybody can say, I think that's wrong, and here's why. Well, I think that's right, and here's why,
Mm-hmm.
biblically. And at the end of the day, there still might be complete disagreement.
Yeah.
But there's also been validation that the person is made in the image of God and has extraordinary value. And a good facilitator will create an environment where that invitation is always extended. Again, that doesn't mean that people come to be disagreeable. That has not been our experience.
No.
People are coming to be formed more like Jesus, but that obviously means there's going to be areas that are confusing,
Mm-hmm.
or there might be dissent, or there might be doubt. And the facilitator's job is not to sort through all that, it's to create an environment where the group can explore it together. And this is very difficult for Westerners.
Oh.
This is not the way that we're used to being formed. We're used to being told what to do and told exactly what the Bible means and told exactly, I've heard this presentation. I'm now going to explore this because I want to get into a deeper and deeper understanding of truth. And oftentimes, that's a multi-layered process.
Oh, yeah.
So I think civil discourse, creating an environment for civil discourse, loving discourse, is an essential component of what a facilitator does, and not kind of fall into the trap of teaching in this environment. Teaching in other environments is essential.
Absolutely.
But not in the greenhouse. That's
Right.
not the purpose. So I think some of that's a distinctive. The 4 rhythms: exploration, reflection, soul care, which is such a beautiful rhythm, and spiritual discipline. And our group we're practicing spiritual disciplines together as a group. So we're kingdom centered. We are studying and exploring Jesus not only as our Savior, but the King of the cosmos, who is redeeming the entire cosmos at present. That's a central idea that permeates the greenhouse. The discipleship dilemma, is basically we need to know Jesus well, but if we don't understand our own history, personal history, if we don't understand our own story, if we don't understand how the events in our past impact the way that we relate now, it's really hard to grow to be more like Jesus. There is an intuitive sense that we have to know both parties, and so we give a lot of space to explore how our past impacts our present, our theological upbringing, family of origin, joys, celebrations, wounds, abuse. Those things are allowed to breathe, understanding that I think is necessary for that to become. It's necessary to do that in order to become more like Jesus. If we don't understand our own hearts, it's really hard. So we have the kingdom, we have story that solves the discipleship dilemma, and then of course we have these very specific communities. And there's lots of. I have been thrilled and amazed, and at times saddened by the experiences. Even that of folks in our own greenhouse. We have 10 folks. 4 of them attend remotely, and 6 are in person. So we're a hybrid group.
Yep.
And we're a parachurch model. So we're not all in the same church. You and I go to separate churches.
Right.
Everybody goes to a separate church.
Yep.
And it's a beautiful mix.
From my perspective, it's not about, okay, well, I'm going to convince this person that they're wrong, or I must be wrong because they think this, so what's wrong with me? It's more about, well, I'm going to ask some questions. I'm going to think, oh, well, why do you think this? Or, so are you saying this? Just to kind of get some clarity. It's not about who's right and who's wrong. It's about, let's explore this. Like you said, let's give the space to have our hearts be able to be open and discuss these things that it's maybe never been able to discuss before, and given a platform to be able to gently and safely explore those things and journey through those things. That's another thing that I think is key with a greenhouse, is that element of safety. This is a place where I can be open, I can be honest. I can be raw. And we've had conversations like that.
Yep.
Several people, I can't think of anybody in our group that has not ventured into that space in one way or the other. And it's not a forced thing. It's not about, well, everybody's got, no, it's if somebody is quiet and wants to kind of observe for a while, that's great.
Yep.
Because you have no idea what's going on in their heart. You have no idea how that's forming. And then when they get to the place where they feel comfortable to say that, then it's going to be so much more beautiful than, oh, well, Charlie hasn't said anything. So Charlie, we're going to start with you. What do you think? I mean, we don't need to put people on blast like that. It's just, hey, you know what? Charlie's thinking.
It's an invitation.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's great. Let's sort of turn to tactical questions. You listened to the episode, and I have the FAQ out there, but you came up with a list of questions that other people might have that are more practical. Okay, how does this actually work? So you came up with a great list. Let's walk through some of those.
Yeah. Okay, so I think one of the big things was about kids.
Oh, yeah.
Can kids be a part of the greenhouse?
Yeah, we talk about a system and not a bureaucracy.
Right.
The least amount of structure is possible to create the most amount of flexibility as we can. Okay. So when it comes to kids, we're talking about massive age difference. On the FAQ on the site, we talk about, look, with young children,
Right.
The group may want to, the point is to avoid interruption and distraction because the conversations can get really important. They can get very personal. And we just want to make space and we want to honor that.
Sure.
So for 90 minutes, 2 times a week, let's come together and figure out a solution where our kids are very well taken care of and not a concern for the participants, but that the rhythms are allowed to proceed without interruption. So this same thing for technology. You turn the phones off and we put them away for 90 minutes because we're dialed in. When it comes to older children or adult children, I do think that should be left up in the way that it's currently done, is left up to the group. So if you have 15, 16, 18, even a young adult like a 21, 22-year-old, I think the group can easily pray through whether or not it makes sense to do that. You just have to be conscious of considerations. Do the parents want certain things shared in the presence of their children? That's a consideration.
Yep.
Is it going to cause a lack of participation with other adult members of the group or not? And I think different groups decide differently. And, again, Soil & Roots, from a ministry perspective, our role is to say, look, we want to provide the least amount of structure that incorporates the 4 rhythms and cultivates deep discipleship and allow the groups themselves an enormous amount of autonomy to work through those things, assuming that the environment is inviting, it's peaceful, it's safe, and that we give every opportunity to invite somebody to participate in that deep discipleship. Those are sort of the parameters.
Yeah, and following those rhythms that you've set up.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question would be, how do I ask people to come to a greenhouse? Is there a certain script, or is there
I know
something that
no. I mean, again, we're trying to the least amount of structure as possible that facilitates the most amount of spiritual formation. I mean, how did ours come together? We just started talking to people about it. Hey, we think that in many corners of the West, there are folks that feel a disconnection from God and from themselves and others, and that we're not really sure if the promises of the New Testament, we're not experiencing what we think we should be experiencing. And a greenhouse is a place to explore and to invite that, to fall into the deep end of discipleship and resolve that disconnection with God and with others and with ourselves, and to experience the more of what the Bible alludes to in terms of a mature Christian. And this is how it works. Would you like to check it out? You know what I mean? Or, some people are referring to these 2 episodes or to the website or whatnot, which are all fine. But my sense is, I mean, when you and I were putting our greenhouse together, when you talk about it in theory, it was evident within about 30 seconds whether or not that was a pain point for somebody or it wasn't. And the people, the reaction from people that had never heard of a greenhouse before was, I have never heard of anything like that, and I need that.
Yeah.
Versus folks that say, oh, that's cool, but I have a cool Bible study in a community.
Yeah.
Well, great, go for it.
Super.
This is not for them.
Right.
But usually the reaction is really evident pretty quickly whether or not somebody is being drawn into the the deeper ends of discipleship.
Yeah.
So in our case, our group was pretty easy. It came together quickly and pretty easily.
Yeah, and when I say script, it's not like, some kind of sales pitch. It's more of, because for me, I like to have like a formulation in my mind of what I want to say to somebody. And so again, these are all the things that we're constantly trying to help greenhouses with and things of that nature. But I think if you just go up to somebody and say, hey, it's all about deep discipleship, that right there, if you get somebody that's like, oh, what is that?
Right.
Then that's probably somebody that's going to be interested.
Conversation starter.
Right.
Yeah.
Then it's just something that you can kind of organically go into and just kind of talk about, hey, these are the things. And it's not about, well, this is what we do. And it's just a conversation, like you said. It's just a very relaxed conversation.
It's inviting.
Yeah.
I cannot stress it is an invitation. And we are not obligated to force or persuade. In our greenhouse, we extended several invitations and talked about it. And the folks that the Holy Spirit was leading in that direction came. And it was not a difficult process at all.
And the ones that couldn't, didn't. And they were like, okay.
And we love them, and maybe down the road it will be.
Absolutely. Yeah. So kind of going off on that, what if I desperately want to start a greenhouse, but I can't find anybody to do it?
Well, get in touch with us. So there's a couple of possibilities. In our greenhouse, we have folks that dial in remotely. We have a hybrid group. So there are groups that are only online, there are groups that are only in person, and then there are hybrid groups. And I think they all can work just fine. So the point is that we want folks to be able to plug in somewhere. And so if they're unable to form one in their own area, just get in touch with us and we'll figure out what we can do.
Again, that's a huge thing. That's another element to this, that we see the value of these greenhouses. We see how impactful they are. And if somebody is coming up to a situation where they're like, man, I would really like to start one, we would be more than happy to walk you through that and help you with that, because there are things that you can explore to do it.
That's what we do.
Yep. Okay. So the other one, so 2 days a week. Is there, and again, I'm asking questions that I know people are thinking. Yeah. And so does it have to be a certain 2 days?
Days of the week?
Does it have to be on a Sunday?
No. It could be whatever the group decides. But what doesn't work for Soil and Roots is not 2 times a week. Right. We have discovered now through being in a greenhouse, when we first started architecting these and prayerfully thinking through how to get them started, we thought, oh my gosh, twice a week, this is never going to fly. Now that we've done it, you realize that it doesn't work unless it's twice a week.
Yep,
like
absolutely.
that is a requirement for sure.
Yep.
And it's a commitment, and we get it. And again, it's an invitation. But twice a week, 90 minutes. We follow the Vince Lombardi rule. We start in time, we end on time. I know you hate that, but that's what we do.
Oh my gosh.
Because we want to honor everybody's time, and because we recognize we live in the West, which has a frenetic pace to it. So we're going to accomplish a lot together of substance, of depth in the time we've allotted. But in terms of the actual days of the week, when we started ours, we had a setup meeting.
Yeah.
And we sat around and we said, well, what works? And so, in our case, we've been doing Thursday nights and Sunday afternoons. And it's worked great. But, in 6 months, it may not be as good. And so we'll change it. Yeah. Again, there's no, it's not a legalistic framework. The structure is twice a week for 90 minutes. Here are the 4 rhythms. Here are the rough time frames in which those rhythms get accomplished. These are designed for a specific purpose to help us be formed in community to be more like Jesus. But outside the gastro gathering, the meal is part of the deal. And the meal's been beautiful. It's part of our greenhouse. It's been an amazing enhancement to the community. Those things are required because they're so fundamental to spiritual formation. But things like, children, things like how is the meal being prepared, or who does it, or what days of the week, that stuff's entirely open to each individual greenhouse. It is a commitment. Yeah. It's a commitment to the group's spiritual formation. Somebody asked me last week, I think, what if, some participants show up only once a week or once every 2 weeks? Well, the challenge is that that's not a commitment to the group. You're committing not only to Christ, you're committing to the group's spiritual formation. If you're not there, it hurts the group. They're not experiencing the fullness of what the group is intended to do.
What you bring to the table.
What you bring to the table.
Exactly.
So it is nobody's taking attendance. Maybe someday we'll have to do all that nonsense, but that's not the point. But in our case, the attendance has been unbelievable. Even when some folks are on vacation, some folks have some schedule conflicts. I mean, they're making every effort to be a part of that community, and it shows. I mean, the strength of our greenhouse is really in the commitment of its folks. That's why flexibility is so important. If your greenhouse meets on Mondays and Thursdays, and 3 months down the road somebody has a job schedule change and they can no longer do Monday, the group has every flexibility to say, hey, look, let's work together and figure out another time that might facilitate for everybody.
Absolutely. So going back to the meal, that I think is another big hot button issue for greenhouses. Again, that when we set ours up, we had a conversation, and this is what we recommend for people that are starting greenhouses: is have this conversation, have these practical talks about what this looks like. Do we want somebody to bring the whole meal? Do we want one family to bring the meal? Do we want to split it up? Do we want to have somebody bring a main course, somebody bring a dessert? All of that is up to the greenhouse. Whatever you guys want to do, whatever works for you. For us, it works to rotate by family. So one Sunday or the Thursday gathering is the gastro gathering. So it might be you and Jessica that provide the meal. Then it's us, and then it's another family, and so it rotates. And so that works for our group. And yeah, I mean, again, balancing all of the things, getting the dinner ready, driving it, transporting it. Yes, it is sometimes it's a challenge, but when you know that's coming and you've had those discussions in your group, then it's not as overwhelming. It's like, oh, well, who's doing it this way? What do we do? But again, when you get to that structure, that's one of the things that you're like, okay, let's do this. Let's have this plan, but then it can change, I mean, you start doing it for a couple of months and you're like, you know what, let's change it up to where somebody just brings the main course and somebody, all right, great. Talk about it.
And the host is the one that facilitates that. So in our group, my wife Jessica is the host, and so we walk new greenhouses through this. You have a setup gathering,
absolutely,
where all this stuff sort of gets ironed out before you start working through the 4 rhythms. And one of the things that's discussed is how do we want to start exploring how the meal is provided. Honestly, the trick with the meal is getting the group started on time, because whoever is responsible for the meal needs to get there early to get it set up and get it ready, because you want the group to start whatever time you've published. That's when the opening prayer starts, so that you're honoring that time. But I mean, usually it takes a few weeks, and folks get in the rhythm, and they're showing up a few minutes early to make sure they have their food and they can sit down and start talking. It breaks all the Zoom protocols because everybody's eating online and you're talking with your mouth full. It looks weird sometimes, but you know what?
It works.
It works. I think it's been a tremendously positive element to our greenhouse, and that's why it's one of the requirements. Let's make sure we eat together once a week.
So that meeting revolves around the meal, and it's so beautiful to see and to be able to break bread with people and enjoy that meal, and just it provides a level of comfort and a level of ease during that whole discussion. That's when you do the soul care. That's when you do the spiritual habits, and it's just it's a beautiful thing to see and be a part of.
It's been awesome, and the food's been amazing. All right, folks. So that's the basics of a greenhouse, and Kyle and I are sort of living testimony to the power of restoring New Testament communities to let's admit is somewhat of a frenetic Western lifestyle. But when we commit to becoming more like Jesus together in a community, and in the greenhouse case, we do it twice a week at 90 minutes, and we're practicing these rhythms: reflection, exploration, soul care, and spiritual disciplines. And we're doing it in the environment, the ecosystem of the 3 primary problems. We want to become kingdom-centric, recognizing Jesus not only as our Savior, as our King. We want to give space to explore our stories and how we fit into God's grand story. And we are intentional about our hearts accepting and embracing Jesus' ideas, that we are, in fact, formed to be more and more like Him. Which sets us up for season 4, which I've been previewing in bits and pieces all season long. So let me just give you 30 seconds on a minute on where we're going. So season 1 was an introduction to deep discipleship and the concept that we are formed primarily through the progressive transformation of ideas and desires in our hearts. Sometimes those align with our beliefs, sometimes they don't. Season 2 was all about heart view. How do we actually determine the ideas in our hearts? And we talked through the 8 indicators, some very practical ways that we, in cooperation with God and some trusted friends, can actually determine what's going on in our hearts by looking at our indicators. And of course, season 3 was all about the formation gap. Season 4 is all about the forgotten kingdom. So one of the primary themes of Soil and Roots is the fact that the gospel of the kingdom has largely been lost in the West over the past really few hundred years. And so we have talked about it in part. We're now going to spend an entire season exploring what is the kingdom, when is the kingdom, how is the kingdom, and the second half of the season will be what does it mean to live in the kingdom, which is going to be just an amazingly, I think, riveting a season of exploration. So thanks so much for listening to season 3. It is so good to be with you. For those of you that are financially supporting us, a huge thank you. We're continuing to grow because you are continuing to support the work of the ministry. And we couldn't be more thrilled with season 3, and we can't be more excited about season 4. If you have questions, you can check us out at www.soilandroots.org. And as always, you can email me or Kyle.
Yeah.
I'll forward it to him.
Thank you.
At fish@soilandroots.org. We'll see you next time for season 4.
Yes.